Hey everybody, this is Matt Garrett from Garrett's Capital Investment. I'm just spending a little time geeking out on a spreadsheet that I'm working on to try to get some direction for 2020 for what I'm going to do with my portfolio. I've got my geeking out on the spreadsheet glasses on, ready to roll here. So I'm going to show you what I got so far. It's not complete, but it's some progress, but it's to give me some idea of my return on equity. To me, the most important thing you can possibly calculate in your real estate investing is the return on equity. I don't care if your property cash flows $10,000 a month. If you paid $10 million cash for it with no mortgage, your return on equity sucks. What I'd like to see is really high cash flow with really low equity. This can be done with no money down deals and things like that. But all of my properties I own completely, so I don't have any JV partners that are taking on all the equity burden. So what I want to know is, should I be selling my properties that I have right now? My end game goals don't involve owning the most doors. I'm not about 100 doors or 1,000 doors or 50 doors or whatever. That doesn't matter to me. What I want to see is the best possible return and for the least possible effort. That's kind of one of my driving factors. So I think the best way to get that is either with really high cash flowing, really high return on equity properties, or perhaps with some private lending. I really love the idea of doing private lending. There's a ton of people out there that are always hunting for money, and I'd like to be lending it. So if what I find is that my properties have a terrible return on equity, then I'm just going to dump them and turn that money into either private loans or into purchasing more properties, either for making money on the buy, like massive equity gains on the buy, or perhaps properties with high cash flow that I can get minimal equity into and get really great returns out of owning property. Owning property has its benefits over lending, of course. You've got your appreciation over time, tax benefits. On the other hand, you've got tenants, you've got vacancy, you've got unforeseen damages, et cetera, et cetera. So without further ramble, I'm going to get into the spreadsheet here a little bit. Shrink me. There you go. Okay, so this is just the start of Google Sheet spreadsheet. I'd be happy to share this. Hit me up, we'll chat about it, whatever. So I've only entered one property in here, and I entered this one specifically because I honestly figured that it would be my worst property in the portfolio right now in terms of cash on equity and return on equity. So I guess I should clarify that. Cash on equity is how much cash it's putting in my pocket each month based on the amount of equity I have in the property. And return on equity is that plus the mortgage pay down. I really should be including price appreciation in return on equity. I just always have an aversion to using any number other than 0 for price appreciation because it might go down 10% next year. We don't know. Who knows what the political environment brings? That's for another podcast. But I just like to use, I like to use 0 for appreciation because it's just not a number that I can determine. So this was my very first property. I'm going to zoom in a little here so we can see a little better. This was my very first property that I ever purchased as an investment, not my first property ever. This house that I live in was my first property ever, but my first investment was this townhouse down in Southdale. Bought it through a realtor. Didn't really do anything special with the buy. This was before I really knew how to buy properties properly. So on this one in particular, we owe $140,000 on this thing, and I have here for sale net revenue. Sale net revenue is how much I expect to get from it, from the sale of it, not including paying off that mortgage, but like how much is there coming, into the lawyer's office, I guess. So this takes away. You can see in my calculation here that we're knocking off 5%, and this is for the realtor fee plus the tax on the realtor fee, and then we're knocking off another $2,000 just for assumed expenses of sale. I don't know what that $2,000 is for. Maybe I got to pay a tenant. Maybe I got to fix a window. I don't know. I'm just throwing $2,000 in as a minimum. So for the purpose of this spreadsheet, any properties that I know have repairs, I'm going to add $2,000 to the amount that I think it needs for repairs. For this property, it doesn't need any repairs, so I'm just using $2,000. So this is my sale net revenue. So gross profit then is the sale net revenue minus the mortgage balance. Pretty straightforward. So as you can see, we got a lot of money tied up in this property. We initially put $30,000 down on it, and we've since done a refi. So there's quite a bit of appreciation that's happened since I bought this back in 2016 before the market spiked. So moving on from there, the cost basis of the property. This was the total cost to basically get from not owning the property to having the property rented. So that's the price of the property, the land transfer tax, the cost of the lawyer, the cost of utility hookups and that kind of stuff when I first bought the property, because it wasn't immediately going to be rented, so the utilities were in my name. The utility costs, basically any of the costs up until the day the tenants moved in are considered the cost basis. I'm not an accountant. If you're an accountant, please correct me. If not, this is reasonable information that you can run with. So moving on, so the capital gains here, this amount is the cost basis minus the net sale revenue. Other way around, net sale revenue minus the cost basis. So this is the taxable amount of capital gains. Now, capital gains are very favorably taxed. Only half of it is actually taxable. And then between my wife and I, we can share it. And we each have a different marginal tax rate. But between us, our average tax rate is about 20%. So what I've done is I've taken the capital gains, the total capital gains, and divide by 2, and then 20% of that, so about 10% in total, is an estimate of the amount of tax that I'll pay. So my after-tax estimate is the gross profit minus the amount of capital gains tax that I would expect to pay. So we're left with about $86,000 here. Now, to me, this is the equity in the property. It's not about how much money you put in your down payment. If you got a $500,000 house, you put 20% down, you've got $100,000 in, you do not have $100,000 in equity. If you try to sell that day, maybe you get 500. Let's say you get lucky and you actually manage to sell it for what you bought it for. You're going to take away the realtor commissions. You paid land transfer tax to get into it. You've paid a lot of money to get into the property and out of that property. So what you have paid for a down payment is not the same as your equity. And that would be the wrong way to calculate it. So this is the amount of money that I could have in my hand instead of owning that property. That's the important part. This is the important number. So yeah, it'd be real nice to have $86,000. That's fantastic. So moving into kind of looking at the monthly numbers. So we're looking at the return on equity, right? So that's the profit of owning it. So this here is the monthly rent times 12. I've decided to do everything annual, just makes the numbers easier to work with. So sliding over a little bit. So the monthly rent times 12, just over $14,000. I'm way under market value on this. Like the rent is $12.26 on this property. Realistically, it should be $15.50, but thanks rent control, here we are. So the mortgage interest, I just calculated this as just the mortgage interest rate times the principal. Pretty straightforward. It's a 3.55% mortgage, so 3.55% of the principal amount, $140,000, is $49.77. Pretty straightforward. For mortgage principal paydown, the mortgage P, all I did was I took my monthly payments, I multiplied them by 12, and then I subtracted out the interest portion. Maybe that's wrong, I don't know. And it even changes each year. So these two numbers, the longer you hold them, the more you shift away from paying interest and into paying principal paydown, which is good for your return on equity, but not as good for your cash on equity. So moving on, property taxes, that is what it is. I found this just by using my assessment and multiplying by the London tax rate, which is about 1.34%. Insurance, this is a condo, so this is super, super cheap insurance. It's like $150 a year. It's basically landlord liability, there's nothing else to it. Rentals and fees, this is where the money really adds up in terms of costs. This particular condo includes the water and includes the structural insurance as well. And the fees have spiked a bit in the last couple of years. So we're paying $372 a month, multiplied out by 12, and we got the $4,500. So when I look at these numbers from the rent column, and then subtract out all these other costs of holding the property here, I'm left with a cash flow, an annual cash flow of $1,144 a year, not a month, per year. So what I've realized now is that with rent control doing what it's done, the refi that I did on this last year, increasing my costs, and the increase in condo fees, I'm not really making any money on this property. So cash on equity, this is the cash flow, so the money that comes out of the property into my bank account each month, divided by the, sorry, I'm just going to scroll over to see what I called it earlier, the gross profit. So this is the after-tax estimate, the real equity, right? So the real equity is your after-tax estimate. So the annual cash flow divided by the after-tax is 1.3%. Like, why don't I have this in a GIC? That doesn't make any sense. Like the return on equity, including mortgage pay down, is 4%. Now, these numbers look just god awful. The reality is this thing has appreciated $100,000 in 3 years. I'm not sad. Like, that's fantastic. Realistically, my ROI is somewhere around like 75% per year, which is absurd. This is for a townhouse in an area of London that has developed recently. I don't see this townhouse continuing to climb $100,000 over the next 3 years. And even if it did, then the return wouldn't be as good as the previous because we have more equity in the property. So, you know, this really gives me an idea that I just shouldn't own this property anymore. There's nothing that I can do to make this property a good investment anymore. Between the condo fees, the low rent, and what my mortgage is costing me, and basically what I have left in the property. You know, this amount of cash flow would be fine if I only had, you know, $5,000 in the property and all I could sell it for and get out of it was $5,000. You know, that'd be fine. That'd be a 20% return. I'd be happy. But the reality is this is not a very good return on this property. So that's kind of an idea of how I'm making decisions moving forward about whether or not I should keep properties. And you can run this entire spreadsheet before you even buy a property. That would be a fine way to do it, right? Look at what it's going to cost you to get into a property. And then look at what the value would be on the sale too. That's an important part, right? Maybe you're buying, you know, on the MLS through a realtor. You're paying too much, right? Because you're now the guy that was willing to pay the most for that property. If you put it back on the market and try to sell it, it's going to sell for less because the second highest guy is going to come back, maybe if you're lucky. So if you're buying wholesale and you're buying, you know, 5, 10, 20% under value, then you can be in an equity position that's above the amount of money that you put in the first place. So those are some of the things that you can consider on the buy. And if you have a portfolio and you're not sure if it's doing well, this might be a good way for you to calculate to see if you should be hanging on to that portfolio the way that it is, or if maybe you should be turning over some properties, sell some things, and buy some others. So I'm gonna spend my day filling in each of my properties down this whole list here, and you know, I'll pick a number, probably, you know, maybe a cash on equity of at least 12%, maybe 15%, and anything below that line, it's time to go. See you later. Don't need that property.